Well, good evening, this is Hound Dog Steve, wishing you a very pleasant evening. And what I'd like to talk about this evening is the concept of a debt jubilee, and why we should have one, and the possibility of actually having a debt jubilee. Now, this is an interesting idea. It's about a 5,000-year-old idea from Babylonia. And it was the idea that when a new king came into office, all debt in the country was cancelled. And this idea, I believe, was continued on by the Jews. And basically what it did was it took the inflation out of the debt situation, because debt really does destabilize not just the individual, but businesses and countries alike. Now, why does this happen? Why do you need to take the inflation out of the situation? So our system, the fractional reserve fiat currency system, is inherently inflationary. And I will be making a separate video on this to explain the whole concept. But very quickly is the concept that interest can never be paid because it is never created with the initial debt. Now I'm going to simplify this down right the way down to the very first bank and the very first borrower. Okay, so there's no other money in the world. There's just one bank and one borrower. Okay, so in our system, the fractional reserve, it means that exactly that. You keep a fraction of what you have on deposit in reserve, and you can lend out a multiple of that. And what it does come down to now in these days is that the banks will borrow money from the Federal Reserve, and the fractional reserve limit is 10 to 1. So for every $1 that they have in their hand, they can create 9 other dollars against that $1, which of course that in itself is inherently inflationary because you're expanding your currency base. So bear that in mind. So you've gone into this first bank and you want to borrow $900. Well, to do that, the bank only has to have $100 in the till. $100, fractional rate of 10 to 1, he can lend out $900. So he writes you a counter check, not real money, gives you a counter check for that $900, and then says, well, okay, I'm going to take some risk here because I am actually giving you $900. Let's add some interest money to cover that risk, and we'll just call that 10%, and we'll round it out at $1,000, $100 interest you've got to pay on that $900. So, well, let's just add up exactly what it is that we have to pay back. Well, I've got my $900 and I've got $100 interest, that's $1,000, and we have $100 in the till. So that's $1,100. But in real money, we only have the $100 in the till and the $900 they got in my check, $1,000. Where does that $100 go to? How does that get paid off? You see, there's no money created in that loan to cover the $100 expense, so it will never be paid off. Now, of course, it's so obvious when you reduce it down to that level of calculation, it's so obvious that that's what's going to happen, and it will happen immediately because the person who's borrowed the money obviously does not have the money to pay back in total the entire loan. But when you have an economy, you know, with $300 billion floating around in America or $30 billion floating around in Canada, there is a lot of dollars washing around, so you don't notice what's actually going on. But that's really what is happening, and all of that unpayable debt, that ends up floating into the national debt, and that is all the unpaid and unpayable debt. And you see, what the Jews realized is that when you reach a certain level, your whole economy, your whole civilization becomes destabilized. Everyone goes into bankruptcy, and wars and fights start breaking out, and that is when you get bankers hanging from the lampposts. Okay, so what they did, what the Jews did, they said, okay, we'll just have a Jubilee Day, we'll cancel all that debt, we'll zero the clocks, and we will begin again. And that kept things relatively stable. Now, over the years, of course, that notion seems to have been lost, and so we've had more than a few crises and collapses over the centuries. But here we are in a situation now where we just have a staggering amount of debt. I am hearing unofficially $1.6 quadrillion when you include all the derivative market and this kind of stuff. These debts will never be paid off. And I think that the only way to solve this is a debt jubilee. Anyway, let's go to this article and I'll come back and do a quick wrap up. Okie dokie, here we go. Zero Hedge, cancelling debt and a debate over 5,000-year-old economic policy. History is repeating itself. A 5,000-year-old idea stemming from a jubilee in ancient Babylon, where a new king would erase the population's debt, is again catching on. But this time in the United States. Talk about an adoption cycle coming back around. It only took 5,000 years. Now the faint echo of this idea, as Bloomberg calls it, has become part of the fabric of Democratic presidential candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who both aim to cancel over $1 trillion in student loans and $81 billion in medical debts. Borrowing for what? Net debt added by US households over the past 10 years. $803 billion in student, $493 billion in mortgage, $576 billion in auto loans, and $43 billion in other, whatever that may be, and $69 billion in credit card. Even President Trump's senior student loan official resigned in October, saying that the American way of paying for higher education was nuts and that wholesale write-offs should be considered. Medical debt and student loan debt are constantly cited as major hurdles for would-be home buyers, according to Zillow. Moody's agrees, saying that removing headwinds from student debt could boost the economy like a tax cut. And it's not just student debt that's causing a headwind. The US relies on consumer spending for growth, and, as everybody but central bankers seem to clearly understand, that spending is coming from cheap debt. Credit crunch, with consumer spending taking up a bigger chunk of the economy and the wage sharing falling, debt has filled the gap. And this is the household debt, non-mortgage, consumer spending and wages. And you can see just what a large part of GDP that is. Debt is becoming an issue across the globe as central bankers' cognitive dissonance continues to reinforce each other's flawed thinking. And, as Bloomberg says, the idea that debt can grow faster than the ability to repay until it unbalances a society was well understood thousands of years ago. Michael Hudson, an economist and historian, recently published And Forgive Them Their Debts, a study of the ancient Near East where the Jubilee is rooted. The practice spread through Sumer and Babylon and also played an important role in the Bible and in Jewish law. The rulers at the time were trying to make sure citizens could meet their own needs and contribute to public projects, instead of labouring to pay creditors, and surprisingly the idea worked. Societies that cancelled the debts enjoyed stable growth for thousands of years. That is why the idea of debt forgiveness in the US spurs talk of a modest increase in household spending and investment and eventually higher rates of home ownership and business formation. Conversely, buying up student loans would increase the government's debt, which is already spiralling out of control and now stands at $23 trillion. Budget deficits each year would also be slightly bigger, to the tune of about 0.4% of GDP in 2018 because of the lost revenue from loan repayments. Not keeping up. Whilst US economies have stagnated, the cost of higher education has soared. And the black is the median household income, and the blue is the cost of 4 years at public college. But the idea of creating a moral hazard from debt forgiveness also needs to be carefully examined, according to William Foster, a senior credit officer at Moody's and the report's lead author. Foster says who would benefit, who would miss out, what attempts at equal treatment there should be. Any plan would also have to address what situation would be for the next generation of students with regard to the accumulating debt. Sanders and Warren have faced headwinds of their own while trying to address the fairness question. One recent study found that wealthier households hold more student loans, which would make writing them off regressive. Pete Buttigieg has presented an alternative, saying he wants financial support for poorer students, saying there's no reason to subsidize richer ones. Foster says debt relief plays into the bigger debate about prospects for younger Americans today, job opportunities, the cost of education, income levels and slower wage gains since the financial crisis. This of course has been hardest on the young. The Great Recession widened an already growing generational wealth gap. And you can see here from the age of 25 how much wealth you have, and once you reach 80 you control most of the wealth. Debt forgiveness was a topic during Obama's administration, as well as the government's tried to help underwater homeowners but failed to reduce the principal on mortgages. Mike Konzel, a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, said there were 5 million foreclosures. It's a real stain on Obama's presidency legacy. They had access to the tools to be able to combat them. Economists Atif Mian and Amir Sufi argued in their 2014 book House of Debt that the economy would have rebounded faster with more write-downs, but Obama's own economic advisor Larry Summer called the idea naive. The fact is, debt causes instability for a society, Hudson concluded. Debts that can't be paid won't be paid. Now, I know that was a bit of a lengthy article, so it will be a quick wrap-up here. One of the big questions I do get asked all the time when I start floating this idea of a debt jubilee, people who have paid off their debts don't like the idea of people who haven't paid their debts getting off scot-free. And so there is a bonus for people who paid off their debts. What you are going to get out of this deal is you're going to go back to a full 100-cent dollar. Okay, so your purchasing power is going to be returned to you. Right now, most people in North America are transacting with about a 5 to 10 cent dollar, because the rest of that value has been inflated away through all of this accumulated debt and currency creation. And so when you go back to zero and then put yourself on some kind of footing, some kind of anchor like gold or Bitcoin would work just as well, anything that is going to limit the amount of loans and debt that can be created by the banks to keep everything in check. And that was the idea of the whole Bretton Woods deal, was we would be on a gold standard, and you could only have as much debt on your books as could be backed by the amount of gold you had in your vault. And of course that came away in 1972, and we've been going insane ever since. And I think this is the only way out of it. It's the only answer. Now, if you have any ideas of how to resolve all of this unpayable debt, please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your ideas, and that is what this channel is all about. And if you've enjoyed this video, please like, comment and subscribe below. And in the meantime, this is Hound Dog Steve wishing you a very pleasant evening, and we'll talk to you very, very shortly. See you now. Bye.